Thomas, Historian General of the Sons of the American Revolution, and we're pleased to have with us today Alan Hoffman and Lloyd Kramer for this edition of Speaking Out About History. We are discussing their new book, Lafayette and the Enduring Struggle for Human Rights and Democratic Governments, and we'll be posing questions to both of them that have been submitted by members of the Sons of the American Revolution. Gentlemen, this episode is a first for us. It's the first time we've interviewed two authors together, and it's also the first time we've featured an edited volume, so I'm looking forward to our conversation today. By way of introduction, Alan Hoffman is president of the American Friends of Lafayette and the editor of the Gazette of the American Friends of Lafayette. He has a BA degree in history from Yale and a JD from Harvard Law School. He got his start on Lafayette with his translation of Lafayette in America in 1824 and 1825, the first-hand account of Lafayette's farewell tour that was written by his personal secretary, which Alan published 20 years ago in 2006. And in addition to publishing scholarly articles on Lafayette, he's lectured widely on Lafayette, including in all 24 states that Lafayette visited during his farewell tour. Alan, welcome. Lloyd Kramer is Professor Emeritus of History and the former Director of Carolina Public Humanities at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where he served 2 terms as Chair of the History Department. He received his PhD in history from Cornell University, and his research and teaching is focused on European history, with a particular focus on modern France and the Atlantic world. He is the author of a number of highly regarded books, including Lafayette in Two Worlds, Public Cultures and Personal Identities in an Age of Revolutions. Lloyd, welcome to you.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Alan and Lloyd, thank you for joining us today. Your book originated from a symposium on Lafayette that was held at Fairfield University in September of 2024, which is actually part of the celebration of Lafayette's farewell tour in 2024 and 2025. And I'd invite you now to provide us with a brief overview of your book to get us started.
Okay, well, I'll take the lead on that one. So, as you noted, this was done at Fairfield University, but it also was fully supported by Fairfield University. They financed all the speakers, they gave us a venue, they brought in C-SPAN to video it. And the book is designed to show Lafayette as an extremely important figure, not only in the American Revolution, but also with regard to his human rights activities. As to the latter, I can't think of anyone from his era, 1757 to 1834, who comes close to him in terms of the breadth of his interest in various aspects of human rights and his follow-through with regard to each of those aspects. So we think that this book is an important book for people to read today in these somewhat fraught times that we're going through. Lloyd, why don't you chime in?
Well, I would simply add that the book is also important because we wanted to connect people who are scholars and who operate to a large extent within the academic world with people outside of academia, because we think Lafayette, who was always bringing people together across national and international borders, is also a figure who can bring people together who are professional historians as well as people who just have a deep interest in history, and how Lafayette's life, his friendships, his ideas, his political actions, how they remain relevant for people who care about transatlantic history, the age of the Atlantic revolutions, but also his continuing relevance for our own time. And I would just note in passing that Lafayette in recent decades has received more attention outside the academic world than within the academic world. And one of our goals was to show how his ideas are also important for historians who are working within the university and how he can be used to open new dialogues and new conversations.
All right. Well, great. Well, let's dive into some of the member questions. We have a few questions, starting with Lafayette's participation in the American Revolution in the founding era. The first question comes from Bobby Hulse of the Kansas Society, who asked, "What do you consider as the defining moment that made Lafayette decide to throw in with the American Patriots? Was it just a matter of conscience, or perhaps a way to gain some leverage against the British as a long-term adversary of France?"
Um, so the answer to this one is found, in my opinion, in the interview that Lafayette gave to an American historian by the name of Jared Sparks at LaGrange in 1828. Sparks was writing a biography of George Washington, and he spent a lot of time with Lafayette. In fact, the handwritten papers that he produced in these interviews can be found at Harvard University. I think it's about 128 pages. But according to Sparks, Lafayette told him that he was first inspired to join the American cause at a dinner given in honor of the Duke of Gloucester at camp in Metz, where Lafayette at the time was in the Noailles Regiment, his father-in-law's regiment in the French army. And the Duke of Gloucester had sided with the Americans in the war and was very critical of his brothers and the ministry's policies. And Lafayette, and at that time, if you think of the time of that dinner party was August of 1775. And if you think about the timing, there was sufficient time for the reports of the battles of Lexington and Concord, and even the Battle of Bunker Hill in June, to have reached Europe and to have reached the Duke and to have reached France. And Lafayette says that he was inspired at this dinner party to join the American cause and to help to shed his blood for the American cause and to help the Americans. And so I think what this tells us, if you take Lafayette at his word, is that while he may have had motivations that included anti-British animus because his father had been killed by British artillery in 1759, and while as a youth he may have been interested and probably was in achieving glory, defined as being well remembered by future generations for your deeds. At least a big part of his motivation was the principles of the American Revolution, of freedom, national independence, and the like. So that's my take on it.
So I think this is an important question about motivation. And of course, it's always difficult to answer that kind of question. But I think it's important to think about Lafayette as part of a community of aristocrats in France, where there was a tradition that acting in the public sphere was an important way of defining yourself as a person, as an achieving leader. And it wasn't just about self-interest, it was about the public good. And Lafayette's own education had focused on figures such as Plutarch, who described ancient Roman and Greek leaders who made their name by acting in political and military affairs. And Lafayette was ambitious from an early age. And for him, that meant acting dramatically, even in the public realm.
All right. Well, great. Well, given Lafayette's background as an aristocrat, did that, I mean, I think you painted a picture of how that informed his views, but did that influence how he conveyed those views related to the formation of our new country?
One of the things that was most striking about Lafayette's success in the American Revolution was that he developed a rapport with the Americans in a way that many French aristocrats were unable to do. That is, he didn't come across as pretentious, as arrogant, as condescending. And there were plenty of French and other European nationalities arriving in America with the idea that they could tell George Washington and these upstart Americans how a good war should be fought, how you should organize your troops. What did it mean to be a military leader? And Lafayette famously came to Washington and said, "I'm here to learn, not to teach." And Washington, like, wow, I can't believe it. This is the ideal aristocrat, so to speak. He has the status and social rank, which was important to Americans, that he came from some place. He was connected to an influential French family, the Noailles family. But he also had a kind of accessibility, a willingness to engage. And I think that may have come from the fact that he grew up in a very rural area of France. He didn't grow up around Versailles among the most elite social circles in Paris. And he was comfortable with people of all social ranks and classes in a way that most aristocrats were not. And I think that's one reason that he was successful. He was admired as an aristocrat and appreciated for the fact that he didn't act like one.
Right.
A unique combination.
Yeah. I just add one or two things to that. Lloyd had already mentioned his education. He would not have gotten that education, which included the study of the Roman republics and the like, if he had not been an aristocrat at that time. Secondly, his contacts included other aristocrats who were similarly minded. It was in the air at that time, the type of principles that led to the American Revolution. And thirdly, pretty early on, probably because he had the aristocratic credentials, he joined the Masonic Order in Metz in 1775 and was able to convene with similarly minded persons who were sympathetic to such things as the American Revolution. So to that extent, I think his aristocratic background was helpful to him in this regard.
Right. Well, thank you for that. And I'm not sure I mentioned, but that question came from Larry Josephowski of our Delaware Society. The next question comes from Chris Grimes of our North Carolina Society, who asked, given Lafayette and Washington's relationship, what do you think drew the two men together, and why has their relationship had such an indelible effect on American history?
And I think the important nature of this relationship comes from the fact that many historians have pointed this out, that Washington had no son of his own. He had a stepson, and Lafayette's father had died when he was only 2 years old. So from the very beginning, there was a complex psychological dynamic in that each of these men found something in the other that was lacking in their own lives. Something of I wouldn't say a father-son relationship, but a relationship in which the younger man was looking to an older man as a mentor, as a guide. And the older man, Washington, was eager to find someone who was younger who would listen to him, look up to him. This was the ideal son in that he was not a rebellious son. Some people have rebellious sons. Washington had found the ideal son, one that said, "I want to hear what you have to say." And I think that built their relationship. Also, obviously, Lafayette had enormous respect for Washington as a leader, that he was, for Lafayette, the ideal public figure. He knew how to listen to different points of view and then draw conclusions and take decisive action. And I think the other part of this question, why has this had an indelible impact on American history? It is because it was a personal relationship that intersected with public goals and public needs. In other words, Washington saw Lafayette as a link to France, to influential people in France, and he wanted to cultivate that relationship. But Lafayette saw Washington as his mentor to help him learn what was going on in America, what were the values of American culture, and how could he, as a Frenchman, facilitate the public needs of America. So it was a relationship that was both personal and public, and it had ramifications for people around them because other people understood that it was a kind of special relationship. You know, Lafayette had Washington's attention and affection in a way that was very unique in a man who was known to be sort of emotionally standoffish with other people.
So I would just add a couple of things to what Lloyd has said. You know, Washington was prepared not to like Lafayette. He was tired of all the aristocrats who had volunteered. They were arrogant. They couldn't speak the language. They wanted high rank. The American officers were resentful, etc. But the Congress, after receiving a letter from Benjamin Franklin in which he said, you got to treat this guy well because he's connected, but for God's sakes, tell the general not to get him killed. He was introduced to him, and you know, to some extent, we could say it was friendship at first sight. And the anecdote that Lloyd pointed out was important. Washington, they were reviewing the troops. It was in early August, and Washington said, "We must be embarrassed to come before you in our condition, you who have just come from the French army." And Lafayette said, "I come to learn, not to teach," which, according to Lafayette's memoir, endeared him to the general. So they were paired right from that very moment in the American Revolution. And I think it's fair to say that Lafayette was Washington's primary supporter during the American Revolution. But what happened after that is they were paired symbolically. And this occurred during the farewell tour, where there were numerous arches with Washington and Lafayette, China with Washington and Lafayette, gloves, ladies' kid gloves with Washington and Lafayette. And that pairing continued throughout our history. The Statue of Liberty, the deed of gift has images of Washington and Lafayette, as well as some of the promotional material. Roosevelt in 1934, at the centennial of Lafayette's death, talked about the relationship. And even to this day, when an American president hosts a French president, they talk about Washington and Lafayette. So it's an indelible part of American history at this point.
Absolutely. Well, the final question in this section comes from Harold Cox of the West Virginia Society, and it's the question is, you know, was Lafayette's participation in the Revolutionary War a decisive factor? In other words, what would have happened if Lafayette had not been involved in the Revolutionary War?
That's a very good question. And, you know, to some extent, it's speculative, but I think we can make some informed judgments. You know, when I started lecturing about Lafayette and the American Revolution, I would sometimes use the line, if it weren't for Lafayette, we'd now be singing God Save the Queen. And originally, I got a lot of heat about that from people in the audience. I don't do it as much, but when I do it now, I don't get the same kind of heat. Of course, I have to say, God save the king now. But it's important to know that the French were involved in our revolution before Lafayette became involved, secretly at first through Beaumarchais and others. But Lafayette's role, in my judgment, was critical. The military role, his most important role, was the Virginia campaign, which set up the siege of Yorktown. But even more important was his diplomatic role. And that occurs principally when he returns to France on furlough from the Continental Army in 1779. And at that time, he's the expert. He's a hero. He's the expert on the American Revolution. And he bombards the ministers, Vergennes and Maurepas, with memoranda, recommendations. But one of them that he sent in July of 1779 is considered to be especially important. And basically, in this memorandum, he recommended the establishment of a French expeditionary force on American soil, which later became Rochambeau's army and was critical in the final victory at Yorktown. I would cite two historians who have emphasized the importance of it. One is the leading 19th century American biographer of Lafayette, Charlemagne Taylor Jr., who wrote about this memorandum. This document is one of great importance in the history of our country and had far-reaching influence on the destinies of the U.S., the United States. It was the starting point of a series of events that led to the surrender of the British Army under Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown. Another historian, James Breck Perkins, who wrote a book called France and the American Revolution, titles this chapter about this document, Lafayette's lobbying the French ministry, Lafayette to the rescue. So I think it's pretty safe to say, at least from a probability standpoint, that Lafayette, without Lafayette, we might still be singing God Save the King.
I think that's important, and Alan has noted the ways in which Lafayette facilitated the alliance with the French. I would just note one other aspect for what would have happened if Lafayette had not been involved in the Revolutionary War. It's difficult to say how the American Revolution might have had influence in Europe or might have been interpreted by Europeans. But one of the important legacies of the American Revolution was the way it was interpreted, analyzed, responded to in Europe. And of course, this contributed somewhat indirectly, but it contributed also to the French Revolution, to the campaign for human rights during that revolution. And Lafayette was very aware of the symbolic connection between what was happening in Europe and what had happened previously in America. And so, for example, after the fall of the Bastille, he sent the key of the Bastille to George Washington, where it was kept. It's still kept at Mount Vernon. And it was a symbolic act, but one of the ways in which the American Revolution became a global event. And remember, America was just a very small kind of marginal place. But someone like Lafayette helped to enhance the visibility of the American Revolution among both the social elites and the political activists and political philosophers in Europe. And I think that's one of the reasons the American Revolution had a transnational influence.
All right. Well, let's transition now to a few questions about Lafayette's farewell tour. And this first question comes from William Reef of the Virginia Society, and he asks, how vigorously did Lafayette press his anti-slavery views during his farewell tour, and what, if any, effect did that have on his visits with Madison, Monroe, and other founders?
Yeah. So I think it's obvious from the public record that he did not publicly advocate for the abolition of slavery during the tour. And I see that as deference to some extent to his hosts and his friends who relied on the labor of enslaved persons. However, he acted in many ways as to make clear his anti-slavery views. And also, it's not only his anti-slavery views, but his view that African Americans should be treated just like everybody else with dignity and respect. And he showed that by the fact that he greeted African Americans or was greeted by them in many American cities. He took steps to visit the African Free School in September of 1824 in New York City. He arranged with the governor of Louisiana to meet with the free men of color who fought with Jackson in the War of 1812 in New Orleans. As to his American friends, he certainly tried, and he had been trying even before the farewell tour. There's a lot of correspondence with Jefferson in particular on that score. But during the farewell tour, in a carriage ride from Monticello, a former slave reported many years later a conversation between Lafayette and Jefferson in which Lafayette was grousing about the fact that he came to America for the freedom of everyone, and he was very disappointed that only some of the people, not all of the people, were freed. He raised the issue at James Madison's table at a dinner with Madison and his friends. He was very close to John Marshall, who spent a lot of time with him in Virginia in 1824. In 1825, he sent John Marshall an anti-slavery pamphlet to read and be educated. Sadly, though, these efforts didn't seem to bear any fruit. Where he was somewhat more successful was really in his posthumous influence with the abolition movement. Thomas Clarkson published a letter in the Garrison's Liberator in 1846, where Lafayette said that I would, and I'm paraphrasing, I would never have drawn my sword in the cause of America had I known that thereby I was helping to found a nation of slavery. Plus, the abolitionists knew all about his Cayenne experiment in the French colony on the northern coast of South America for gradual emancipation. And they referred to these two things in particular in speeches and in writings. And one of our colleagues makes a very important point that Charles Sumner, in particular, gave a speech at the very beginning of the Civil War which was later became a pamphlet, Lafayette the Faithful One, which was designed to buck up the courage of the radical Republicans who were getting cold feet when the Southern states were starting to secede. So that's John Stouffer. He wrote an essay in our book. So he feels very strongly about Lafayette's influence in that regard.
I I have the book right here. I can't help but hold it up since this is kind of our theme. And several of the essays in this book deal with Lafayette's support for the abolitionists. Uh, but the other aspect of the tour that was important was that he was accompanied through parts of the tour by Frances Wright, Fanny Wright, who was an abolitionist and an early feminist. And she developed the idea during this tour that she was going to start her own farm area near Memphis and bring enslaved workers there, help train them, and then free them in the same way that Lafayette had this vision for Cayenne, the land that Alan mentioned down in South America. So his relation with Fanny Wright was very confusing to many Americans, including Jefferson, because Fanny Wright went to Monticello with Lafayette and confronted Jefferson much more, I should say, forcefully than Lafayette did. And this relation with Fanny Wright complicated the tour for some of his Southern friends. She welcomed an opportunity to meet a Haitian refugee in Philadelphia, which was seen as quite a radical intervention. Lafayette also met this person. So there were themes of abolition that were somewhat understated during the tour, but people were aware of it, especially with Fanny Wright. And the other element I would mention about the tour that had an important human rights dimension was that in a number of places he met Native Americans, representatives of different Native nations and tribes, some of whom he had actually known their ancestors, in the Oneida community in upstate New York. He met some Creek Indians, some Choctaw. He made an effort to engage with Native people as well as with African Americans wherever he went. And this was a gesture of affirmation that said all people in this country are important. And it's not just the white European Americans, it's everyone. And that was a bold and important theme in his tour.
All right, thank you for that. The next question is, what do you think was Lafayette's most memorable stop on his 1824 and 25 tour? And this question is from George Thurman of the Georgia Society.
Okay. So, Lloyd and I have our own most memorable stops. But the one that I find most memorable is July. It's a day, actually. It's not just a stop. It's July 4th, 1825 in New York City. He had come back from his Western swing to officiate, or not to officiate, to help lay the cornerstone of the Bunker Hill Monument on June 17th. And then he traveled further into New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, the 24th state. And ultimately, he wanted to be back in New York for July 4th to celebrate the 4th. And he arrived on the 3rd by steamship from Whitehall, New York. And the next day was full, you might say. So the itinerary included the laying of the cornerstone of the Apprentices Library in Brooklyn, which I'll get back to because I think it has a lot of wonderful connections, consecutive parades by the military, fire companies, and tradesmen, a church service where the Declaration of Independence was read, speeches in City Hall, a visit with the Society of the Cincinnati, an elaborate dinner at City Hall, a performance at the Palace Theater, and a fireworks display at Castle Garden, which was attended by approximately 10,000 people. So that's a pretty full day. One little incident at the dinner party, they cut a cake at one point. The mayor actually cut the cake and a pigeon flew out. And when they captured the pigeon, it had a poem that had been written from the perspective of the pigeon. And I'll just read you a stanza. All hail Lafayette, hail guest of the nation. I come from thy home o'er the bounding blue wave, whence thou to the fight of a country's salvation went forth in thy youth, heaven gifted to save. So I want to return to the laying of the cornerstone at this library. So there was a man by the name of William Wood who was a successful businessman. He was born in Massachusetts. He had started subscriptions for public free libraries for working men, and he had already built at least 3 of them, one in Nahant, where I think he grew up, Nahant, Massachusetts, one in Boston, one in Manhattan. And he set up a subscription for the one in Brooklyn. And he invited Lafayette to lay the cornerstone. One of the other people present was Walt Whitman, who was just a child. He was with over 400 school children. He wrote about this years later. With other gentlemen, the general assisted in lifting the children amid the deep cut excavation and heaps of stones to safe spots where they could see the ceremony. I was taken up by Lafayette in his arms and held a moment. He pressed my cheek with a kiss as he set me down. So this man would promise Lafayette, if he helped lay the cornerstone, that he would send him a what turned out to be a barrel of soil from Bunker Hill. So he wrote the selectmen in Charlestown in 1829, and they agreed. The Bunker Hill Aurora reported that summer that the Charleston selectmen had agreed. This particular soil had an interesting connection to General Joseph Warren, a martyred hero of the 1775 Battle of Bunker Hill. The paper reported, quote, "The earth will be taken from near the spot where General Warren fell, and the earth that drank the blood of Warren will surround the body of Lafayette." So there's some dispute about whether Lafayette brought soil back with him, whether it came from some other place than Bunker Hill, but I think this is the best evidence here that it was shipped to him in 1829 and used during his burial.
That is a neat story.
Yes, and that July 4th in New York was clearly a remarkable celebration. It was the only July 4th that he celebrated in the United States. But for me, the most striking day might have been when he arrived in Philadelphia in late September of 1824, and he was led into the city by groups of workers representing the different skilled laborers of the city. He was taken to the building, which he referred to as the Hall of Independence or Independence Hall. There was a huge crowd there. And he gave a speech that exemplified the themes that he used at every stop across the country. He said, "I am so honored to be here, where the plans for the great American Revolution were developed, the most successful revolution in modern history, and the revolution that led to self-government." And he said the fruits of that revolution can be seen all around us in the amazing prosperity of this city and of the United States. And the great leader, George Washington, was chosen at this site. And the wisdom of his leadership and the achievements of the Continental Army are also connected to this Independence Hall. So the self-government, the success of the Revolution, the prosperity of America, the uniqueness of George Washington and the Continental Army, these were the central themes of early American nationalism, American national identity. And at that one event, Lafayette hit all the right themes in a way that shows why Americans thought he was the smartest man in the world. Because in a way, he affirmed the ideas and the ideology of the emerging American nationalism of the 1820s.
Both obviously very memorable moments, and what was probably many memorable moments along that tour. The last question in this section comes from Steve Hull of the Texas Society, who asked, Lafayette maintained these lifelong relationships with American leaders, and what can modern organizations like the SAR learn from his model of transatlantic partnership and shared purpose?
Well, I'd like to comment on that because I think Lafayette, who is known as a prominent figure, but what he was especially good at doing was building networks, building connections between people, realizing that organization that structures of social life are essential for the advance of political principles, for the key achievements of any group of people. You need community. And the way in which he promoted that community was through correspondence. Of course, he didn't have email or Zoom, but he wrote thousands of letters. That's a good organizational model. And above all, he showed respect for the people he dealt with. He did not have an arrogant attitude toward other people. He wanted to hear their ideas. He understood that to achieve goals, you needed collaboration, cooperation. And I think this is a model for anyone who is part of an organization that wants to have some impact on the world. You need networks of collaborators. You need a lot of hard work. That means a lot of correspondence, a lot of communication. And above all, you need to give each person in the group a sense that they are respected, that their ideas matter, and that we're going to draw on everybody's achievements and talents to build the organization, to build the nation, to build the institutions that will endure after we as individuals are gone. That's what I take away from Lafayette's model.
Well, I like that, and I heard 4Cs in there, Lloyd. So maybe it's Lafayette's 4C model that successful organizations can leverage community, communications, collaboration, and cooperation. How about that?
There you go. It almost sounds like a slogan you could put on the side of a poster and say the SAR and then the 4Cs or something like that. Good idea, Jeff. I think you could be the leader of that collaborative project, the Lafayette for our time.
Let's round out the conversation now perhaps with a few closing questions. The first one comes from William Kirkland of our Alabama Society, and he asks, Lafayette spent his life trying to stay true to the ideals he believed in while also honoring the people who shaped him, especially Washington and his own family. And in all of your research, is there a moment that shows his character most clearly, a moment that helps us see the man behind the public hero and understand why he still matters today?
Well, I'd like to pick a moment in early September 1781 in the vicinity of Yorktown in Williamsburg. When the French fleet under de Grasse arrived in the Chesapeake, de Grasse offered to land 3,100 French troops under Saint-Simon, which, combined with the 4,500 to 5,000 American troops composed of Continentals and Virginia militia, would have equalized the forces between Cornwallis, who had about 7,500, and the joint American-French forces. De Grasse also offered to land 1,800 sailors if Lafayette committed to storm Yorktown immediately. De Grasse was concerned about his leaving his principal duty, which was to protect the French West Indies for too long a time. Now, at this very time, Lafayette had learned that Washington and Rochambeau's army were on the way, and they were pretty close. So Lafayette refused. And, it must have taken some guts. This de Grasse was 6'6", a very strong-willed admiral. He believed that such an assault might succeed, but would be risky. And even if it did succeed, it would cost many lives. He also believed that since Rochambeau and Washington were on their way, why take the risk of an assault by as many, perhaps as 10,000 against 7,500 when within weeks that force would grow to 18,000. So, in a sense, the rest is history. The joint forces arrived, and the siege guns, French siege guns, and French engineers planned the siege, and it was successful. Now, during the farewell tour on October 27, 1824, John Marshall addressed Lafayette directly outside the Capitol, and he said this: during the Virginia campaign, you, quote, so happily uh, tempered the enterprising courage of youth with the caution and prudence that belong to riper years. So I see this as a kind of a signature moment in his military career, for sure.
Certainly a defining moment. Lloyd?
So I think this is an excellent question because it affects the way we understand what Lafayette stood for. And what he stood for was a set of ideas or principles about self-government, about human rights, about representative institutions. So if you want to look at some defining moments, I would choose two periods in time. One was in the early 1800s when Napoleon Bonaparte was consolidating power, an authoritarian regime in France, and Napoleon and his advisors, people around him, offered Lafayette a couple of positions. One, he could be a permanent member of the Senate, which was a kind of rubber stamp for Bonaparte's policies. Or he might be the American ambassador, the French ambassador to the United States. And he refused those opportunities, and he also refused to support Napoleon when he defined himself as consul for life and then as emperor. And he wrote Napoleon and said, I cannot support you because I think you're violating the ideals of our nation, which were laid. And what he was saying was, we've defined the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and you're just ignoring that. And even though it would have been to his advantage to support Napoleon, to go along with whatever Napoleon asked him to do, he had the courage to say no, even to write him a letter and say, I don't support you. Very few people had that kind of courage against Napoleon. And then in 1830, during the Revolution of 1830, and the King Charles X was overthrown, and there were people who said that Lafayette should become the provisional president, that he should take the power in his hands. And Lafayette said, no, it's not about me. It's about the nation. He supported Louis Philippe. Maybe that wasn't the best decision, but he refused to seize power for himself. It was never just about his own glory or power. It was about something that was more important: the values of the nation, human rights, resistance to authoritarianism. And I think this is the character that makes Lafayette important. It was also the reason that people like Napoleon thought he was a fool. They said, this guy doesn't understand how the real world works. It's all about power. And Lafayette said, no, ultimately, it's about certain ideals and principles that are the real power in human history.
Certainly two defining moments where Lafayette demonstrated the conviction of his principles in action. One additional question here, following on to that, is what do you think Lafayette's singular, most enduring contribution to the struggle for human rights? Was it in the areas of abolition or suffrage or religious freedom movements, and then talking specifically in the context of the United States?
Well, I would pick up on that, and I would say, kind of building on what I just stressed in terms of his relation with Napoleon, for example, or his support for abolitionism, I think his most enduring contribution was his insistence that human beings must defend ideals, principles. And these ideals include all kinds of human rights, free speech, freedom of religion, freedom to participate in government institutions. He even supported in the last years of his life a woman's right to divorce, which had become illegal in France. So his most enduring contribution, I would say, would be his willingness to take risks, to put his own self-interest at risk, to defend principles that he felt were essential for human freedom, for human rights, and for human democracy or self-government. And that's one of the themes this book that we're talking about tries to stress, which is why he remains important in our own time when there are so many places around the world where human rights are ignored, where democratic values and institutions are denigrated, where people think we need strongman leaders. And Lafayette remains a kind of beacon of the alternative to that kind of ideology, that kind of political organization. And when people feel vulnerable, when people feel that this cause is hopeless, they can take up the story of Lafayette and say, hey, he went through some incredible struggles. He didn't lose hope. He didn't always succeed, but he never gave up. That's an enduring contribution.
Absolutely.
So I would just supplement that by saying that what impresses me most about Lafayette, and by the way, I didn't come to Lafayette by learning about his human rights career. I came to it, of course, when I translated the book about the farewell tour. But as the more I learned, I became more and more amazed, really, at his human rights career. It was broad and comprehensive. I mean, from religious freedom and helping the Protestants in the 1780s, of course, anti-slavery, support for Native Americans, support for women, uh, support for increased suffrage in France, support for free publication, public education in France. And when he was here in America, he visited numerous schools and spent a lot of time with school children. Support for prison reform, support for Native Americans. One of the last speeches he ever gave was against the death penalty, in which he said, I will not be persuaded to support the death penalty until it is demonstrated to me the infallibility of human judgment. So he was as one speaker said during the farewell tour, he was a universal philanthropist. And there's really no one like him who is even close to what his human rights career, in my opinion.
All right. Well, very good. One closing question here, and it goes back to the book's opening paragraphs, which states that the symposium's goals were to explain why Lafayette still matters, both for democratic political cultures and ongoing campaigns to defend human rights. And what conclusions were drawn about why Lafayette still remains so relevant today in that's the talks in that symposium and the volume that has been published?
Well, I will start with the response on that. One of the themes we talked about was how that Lafayette had been valuable to Americans at various phases of American history. During the American Revolution, as we've talked about, he was a key mediator between America and France. He helped to support the war. He gave Americans what they needed to get through that great event. And then during the Great Tour of 1824-25, as we've also talked about, he helped to affirm the new American national identity, the key values, what the memory of the Revolution meant. And then in the decades after he died, he remained a symbol for the abolitionists, for people who were supporting the struggle to overturn slavery. And they turned to Lafayette. And then if you fast forward to World War I, the Americans go to France, and when they arrive in Paris, General Pershing goes to Lafayette's grave, and there's the famous moment that, his I think it was his aide-de-camp who actually said it, but Lafayette, we are here. We have come to repay the debt. And when Americans needed someone to symbolize what the war to make the world safe for democracy meant, they evoked Lafayette. And again, the first, the American airmen who went called themselves the Lafayette Squadron or the Lafayette troops. And then, of course, later on, all kinds of diplomats and presidential figures appealed to Lafayette. And our conclusion was, in this time, Americans need Lafayette again, because we need historical allies who refuse to compromise on human rights, who don't give up on the value of democratic institutions, who believe that a society will be more just, more equitable, more enlightened if it protects self-governing institutions, if it recognizes democracy as superior to authoritarianism or empire. So Lafayette serves the present generation in a new way, but in ways that build on a history that goes all the way back 250 years ago, we might say, America 250, to 1776. And that's why we concluded the book by saying, like Pershing in Paris, Lafayette, we are here. Nous voilà.
I can't add anything to that.
All right. Well, Alan and Lloyd, I want to thank you for joining us today. I've really enjoyed our conversation and gladly recommend your volume on Lafayette to our members. Thank you both.
Thank you, Jeff. It's been a real pleasure, and we've only scratched the surface, so the conversation will continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. It was very enjoyable.
All right, great. Thank you both.